We are ready for the 23rd class in the UBC Ecosystem Modeling course called FIS 501. And today I will be talking about spatial planning. And let me start off though by mentioning to you, especially to those who don't know UBC, that we are normally a host here at the Institute for the Ocean and Fisheries. But of course we've all been sent home, and I'm talking to you from my home, which is on campus over here. But this photograph here also reminds me that I'd like to acknowledge that we here at UBC are at Coast Salis territory, and that we acknowledge that we are at the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, the Tsleil-Waututh people, and the Squamish people. And also, I would like to remind you that the recordings from this course are available at the Ecopath YouTube channel and the Facebook page. Look for Ecopath in those two places and you should find them. And you can also find the lectures at the Google sites: lectures, tutorials, readings, assignments, schedules, and so on. I'm almost reminded, I haven't told any jokes, but I've often told variants of a joke about which month is the best month to spend at some place you don't want to be, not to name the place. And the answer to that one is February, because it's the shortest. So from that perspective, this is the best talk I'm going to give at FIS 501. Why? Because it's the shortest. You may have found that I'm totally incapable of evaluating how long time it takes to give a presentation. Usually it's not as do what I say, don't do what I do, or whatever it is. It isn't so that you can trust. If I say it's an hour, it probably takes 2 hours. In this case here, there are only 12 slides. So it's going to be pretty short, and that means today we're going to spend the bulk of the time first on a demo and then on a tutorial, which I will walk you through here, and we can do them together. I don't know what happened here. I must have clicked the wrong place. Okay, back again. So I'll be talking about spatial optimizations today, and I'm skipping all the theory behind how it is and looking much more at the practical application of it. This all came about because some years ago the Hewlett-Packard Foundation had a call for developing methods for ecosystem-based management. It was a very rare one because it was because it was focused actually on methodologies. It was not the usual one applied here or there. And we had at that time been thinking and developing, maybe even started a module for optimizations, which we called Ecosim. It's what you see on this graph here on the left. And while we developed that, we also realized we could make another spatial optimization routine that we then implemented and published, and it hasn't really been used. Neither of these have been, as far as I know, have been used for anything serious, which is a pity because they are actually very capable routines. So I'll give you a little bit about the background in them and then show you how they work in practice. The Ecosim routine comes first. If I can get the slide moving here. Oh, too fast. So it's a routine for spatial modeling, for how to optimally place and size marine protected areas. And it builds on the same objective function as we have in Ecosim, the one we talked about maybe a month ago, for how you optimize fishing effort based on ecological, social, economic, biological criteria. So we can set it up, this objective function, with rent, with jobs, with diversity, with long-lived species, and a few other things. The way this one works is that you can go out and you can place some seed cells. It can be the whole map. It's just going to take longer if you do it. So to illustrate the principle of how it works, let's assume we have an example here where we have 3 seed cells. The program then goes out and it tries to close one, and the second, and the third, and for each of them it does an ecospace run. So in the first instance here, it decided to close this cell over here on the right. And once it closes this cell, it makes the 4 neighboring cells seed cells. So in the second round, it will do 6 runs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in that order. The order doesn't matter. And in this case, it will then decide, which one of these 6 has the biggest impact on the objective function, whatever it is we're optimizing for. It will then pick that cell and turn that into an MPA, and it will continue. And you can see in C, we've closed down maybe 1/3 of the map, and the neighboring cells again have been made C cells. And finally, you can see when we get down to the D in the lower right, that the way that this model is managing it is by basically keeping a few open spots and then closing the rest. So it keeps individual cells open, which has to do with dispersal from these, that these cells feeds the neighboring cells. So the neighboring cell, the closed cells, feed the open cells here. So keeping some cells open in order to still have fishing opportunity. So it lifts up the higher biomass in the closed areas, some of it spilling over into the seed cells where fishing still is allowed. So the process will then continue on until the whole map is closed. And we can then evaluate what happens over time. So here we have the example where 85% of the cells are protected, and you can see what I just talked about, how it keeps fishing opportunities open. This is a little bit like managing salmon coming back, that the whole cell everything is closed, but there are a few openings where fishing can be allowed when salmon are coming back and moving through the area. Okay, now this is not good. I forgot the slide that shows what happens over time. In this case here, what happens is that it's actually able to keep fishing going until we get over to around here 85-90% of the cells are closed, and then only then does it drop off. Biomass is built up. So it evaluates that whole sequence from 0% closed to all of it closed. I'll continue here with the second, and in my opinion, much more interesting method. The eco-seed, it's interesting. It's not very efficient, and it allows us to do certain things. It leaves a number of things open. For instance, does it matter where you start with the seed cells? Should everything be seed cells? And a number of other issues. But the second approach is really the one that's most interesting. To get us there, I'm going to briefly introduce Marxan. And if you don't know Marxan, it's the most widely applied tool for spatial planning. You can read about it at marxansolutions.org or just Google it. So it's a systematic reserve design approach, software you can download for conservation planning. It looks at species distribution and cost evaluation. Initially, it was developed for land applications, terrestrial applications, where you had an idea about where the different species were, and then you would say, we would like to preserve the habitat for 40% of the habitat for this species and 60% of the habitat for this species, and so on. And then it would evaluate what's the cost of doing that, what's the cost of the land, for instance. And it would also look at boundary effects. If you had basically, if you have many small areas, you have a lot of border you may need to protect. You may need to have rangers on land that looks after this. If you have one big area, it's more easy to protect it. And the same applies in a way for the same logic about whether to have many small areas or a few large areas applies also to terrestrial systems. And we get around that by looking at the boundary, how big the boundary area is relative to a protected area. Now, one issue with Marxan is that the ecology going into it, so food web effects, is there enough food for these in these places, in what you protect? Connectivity between different protected areas are not well covered, and socioeconomic consequences aren't either. So we developed EWE's optimization approach as a supplement to Marxan analysis. Here's a screenshot of some of the things it's being used for. It is, as I mentioned, the most widely used conservation planning software. It's being used, has been used for a large number of different marine spatial planning, not just exercises, but implementations. Giving you some examples here. One of them being tuna conservation in Gulf of Mexico. You can look at it a bit more closely here. There are 8 species down there which have varying level of concern. Density maps here, distribution maps for the various species, which when you combine that with what kind of concern there are for them, like bluefield tuna is endangered, out of it comes priority areas for different seasons for the Gulf of Mexico, as we're looking at here, which can then be used to come up with where will it be most efficient in order to preserve these 8 species to place marine protected areas. Now, I'm showing you this because we can do exactly the same with Ecospace. The difference, we can do the same with the same layers going into it. So these layers here of where the species are will be conservation layers, or can be. They are conservation layers in Marxan, that's what they call them. And we can read the same files into Ecospace and do analysis there which have the same objective but different objective functions. So we want to preserve this, but our objective functions are not how much do we preserve of these 8 species where they occur. It's rather how do we select cells from here and set up protected areas so as to maximize our objective function. And our objective function, it can include these, but it doesn't need to. It can be how do we do this so that we preserve, or so that we optimize the number of jobs in the area, given the constraints that we want to preserve these species. What are the implications? So what are the ecological, social, economic consequences using the same objective function as we used again for Ecosim? That's what we're trying to do with this approach. So the way it works is we have in Ecospace, in this routine here, we have a number of importance layers, very similar to Marxan's layers, conservation layers, importance layers. So we can have a number of those. They do not need to be in the model. So in the example that's in this publication down here, these layers were something like distribution of an endangered species where where a whale would be breeding, and some other, whatever it was. 3 things that were not in the model, but they were what we wanted to have preserved as much of as possible. So the way it works is it puts a weighting factor on each of these, or you put a weighting factor on each of these importance layers, and then we select a number of cells for protection. We run Ecospace, we evaluate what the consequences are of the objective function, and we do that thousands of times. And at the end of it, we go out. So in this example here, we run, I think, 20,000 runs of the Ecospace. And then we select the 1% that has the highest objective function. And we then look at how many times the various cells were included in the run. This is what you'll see here on the next slide. So this one here, 20,000 runs, top 1% objective function. And you can see here how many times if we were to close 20% of the area, which 20 cells would be included the most time. So the assumption is that that's where we get the optimal selection of cells of interest and still have fishing opportunities, socioeconomic aspect covered, and a healthy ecosystem, whatever went into the objective function. Again, it can be things such as profit in the fisheries, number of jobs in the fisheries, the longevity of the species there as a measure of ecosystem maturity, diversity, and also the border length. So the way we evaluate the border length is like this. Well, that might not. If you have a given cell, there's only one cell closed, like this one here with the 6 in it. If that was the only cell closed, the border would be 4 and the area would be 1. So the border length here would be 4 divided by 1. It will try to optimize that so that we get more contagious closures out of it. Yeah. And last slide. This is a new record. One thing you have to remember, now actually I want to go back here. I want to go back and show you this. This is an Ecospace run which has 10 by 10 cells. So a very simple, fast model to run. You can do a lot with even such a simple model. You don't need to figure out how to do things, to get things running and so on. You don't need the pretty maps. You need to figure out the model, how it works, how you get it running. And you can do that with something that's fast and get everything sorted out before you go in and do the more complicated ones like these would be. So the next step here is a 20 by 20. Again, you can do a lot with that, and just using this in a gaming mode to figure out how things work, see what's important, what's not important, is really useful. And that's really what we're looking for with this is what's the best of alternative methods. And we can screen for that. We don't need to be precise on how they work on coming up with this exact predictions. It's important here that we can try different scenarios, we can enter them, we can run them quickly. And where this work really belongs are in workshops where you bring together people working with this, have stake in it, and try alternative things. That's a very good way of using it. Sure, it's being used, these approaches are being used more and more in complex management of complex marine spatial planning exercises, projects, like you see here. But the ones where you explore them has to be part of it, and that's one thing that the approach here really opens up for. It was a short and definitely not the best presentation. Coll, do you have any comments to this?
Yeah, I do.
I knew you would. We've been talking about it over the last couple of days.
When the first exercises started to occur in places like the California Marine Life Protected Plan and in the Gulf of Mexico and so on, where stakeholders were brought in to look at
don't you have a camera, Coll?
Yeah, I don't. Jesus Christ. Yeah, where people started to look at alternative layouts for protected areas. They were very often in those meetings, they were told that there was going to be an overall objective to protect something like 20% of the area. That came from U.S. people who were thinking you shouldn't have the biomass go down by more than 80%. I mean, that's a silly argument. So they would set up these basic standards and then ask the participants in the workshops to recommend alternative ways of achieving that percentage goal. And immediately when that approach was taken in workshops and so on, what you found was that fishing industry representatives in particular would want to have a large number of small protected areas as far as possible from fishing ports, so as to have the minimum possible impact on local communities along the coastline and so on. And on the other side of that, you had modelers who were looking at spatial mixing effects between areas who were saying, no, you need large protected areas because if you have little tiny ones, basically the fishing effect just wipes out any protection for a little tiny area that's isolated where fish are moving in and out of it fairly rapidly. So this argument about whether to have a lot of little tiny protected areas, which are favored by fishing people, or a few large ones that are favored often by biologists, that came to be called the SLOS debate. Single, large, several, small. And it remains the heart of the basic debate whenever there is a participatory process in protected area design. So far, Marxan has certainly not handled that issue well, and neither has Ecospace. But it's central. If things didn't move, like rockfish in BC, it worked just fine to have oodles of little tiny protected areas that didn't interfere much with anybody's use of the marine environment. But with things that move around, you become much more intrusive of particularly economic opportunities for fishing. The costs of fishing go way up, and they're differentially borne by different fishing communities. So if you put a big protected area right in front of the city of Morro Bay in California, you essentially wipe out that fishing community. They can't afford to go far enough to get outside that MPA to fish at all. So Billy said it's not anything to worry, but that's wrong. It's the central issue in protected area planning. Fair enough?
Fair enough. It was I was referring to what this acronym was called. These questions are important, and you can address them with a well-designed ecospace model.
The first time we used Ecospace in a participatory planning process like this was in California with the California Marine Life Protected Area Act that mandated about 20% of the California inshore environment be closed. And people jumped in, biologists on one side with a lot of little favorite places they wanted to protect where sea lions fed and whales were concentrated and certain kinds of fish that they adored were present. And then the other side of every room was a large number of fishermen who were basically arguing that the areas the biologists wanted to protect were also the most productive fishing areas. And so we tried to use Ecospace to help inform that debate. And what came out of it was that there wasn't any best way to do it. A lot of their concerns were about relatively mobile species, like the California sardine that migrates up and down the coast every year. And they wanted to be sure it was protected as a base on the food chain. But when you look at that in Ecospace with the dispersal rates as high as they are, and mixing rates for a species like that, you have to have at least half of the area total coastline closed to do any good at all for those species that move around like that.
But why
So
would they be in the
all the
space?
Ecospace did was to enhance the debate. And it caused the people that were doing the planning to move back to a simple-minded, Marxan-like habitat-based approach of saying we need to protect X% of each of these habitat types, rather than talking about species protection at all. So the Ecospace analysis forced them to be honest that they really didn't. They really weren't concerned about an awful lot of species that are mobile because they tend to be more productive. What they were really concerned about were very particular protection issues like marine mammal foraging areas and habitats for unusual small benthic species that don't move around.
So in going back to here, Carl, in your example there, I'm talking about use a model for what it's good for. That includes the analysis here too. Why wasn't sardine just managed traditionally by fishing effort? And you don't need a marine protected area for sardine. It's not even going to be efficient the way they move around.
Well, there was really strong hesitation. In fact, I think the way the California MLP was written was they wanted to avoid areas that were selectively protected to particular fishing gears only. You get into a bunch of problems when you do that. So, in a lot of places, like here in BC, I think, we have had to go that selective approach. So we allow fishing for pelagic creatures like salmon in rockfish conservation areas as long as they don't use gear that will intercept rockfish. But that early planning thing, the whole idea was an MPA meant someplace where you don't kill things at all. So it cast all of the creatures in the same treated them as being in the same basket. I don't know where they're at now with that. I think probably now all of their protected areas do have selective opportunities for particular fishing gears to operate like ours do.
Yeah.
BC.
Okay, let's go and do some demo of how it's implemented. For that, we need to go here. And we need to open Ecospace. The Easter egg is gone and we're back to normal. So I'm going to be using this very simple ocean South China Sea model that was used for the 2009 publication. And you have a link where you can download that in the presentation. So this is a very simple hypothetical model. Almost. There's a little bit data behind it from 1990 or something like that. And we can go to Ecosim. Run Ecosim. Just to see what's in there. Flat line, that's great, so nothing is changing over time. That's fine for our purpose here. And we have these groups and we have 3 different kind of fleets. Good. Then we can go down to Ecospace and we can do the same. Again, this is just to get an idea of what's in the model. So let's go in here and do a run. Go into map and just run it. But it's done now. Then let's go and look at Ecoseed. I just want to see the maps. I've got 3 cells set as MPAs. I checked that because, anyway, to get down, the next step is go down to the one tool there is in Ecospace tools. It's just this one called Spatial Optimization. We can hide this, we don't need that right now. So in here we can put a start here and end here. That's because you may, for instance, be running a model where you fit it over a certain time period, and then you come up to today and you want to look into the future for what's optimal placement. Or you can also, of course, choose to do the optimal placement for the historic time, where you know how the climate was, where you know what happened, and run it there. That's you have a flexibility here. There's a base here, which only is a reference to where does your economic value come from, regards to profit, for instance, and notably, which feeds into the objective functions that you see down here. The objective function is then defined based on these 6 components: net economic value, profit; social value, that's employment, and that can come from the value chain with full employment data that Santiago was talking about a month ago, or it can come from something as simple as what's the job catch values of the multiplicative factor for each of these fleets, some relative to how many dollars landed value they have will have more jobs than others. It's not reflected here, just default values. So that's social value. Mandate rebuilding is where you can tell it that you want to rebuild some of these groups, one or more of these groups, to a certain level, and you really penalize the objective function when they have not reached that level. Ecosystem structure relates to longevity, so one of Odom's measures, and it's populated over here on the right. So for these groups here, so this value here is the biomass production ratio. It's the inverse, if you go back to basic input, it's the inverse of the production biomass, which has the unit per year. You reverse that or invert that, get the biomass production unit with unit biomass production ratio with unit year. Bentopalladics POB is 0.10, so we invert that and you get something that's almost 10. Go back here. 13? That's weird.
It's bentopelagic.
Oh, it's the next one. It's 9.6. Ah, okay, good. It was almost 10. So that's what they come from. When you're using that one, it will try to maximize the longevity in the system. So getting more long-lived species if you use this. There's a biodiversity, which is based on Shannon's diversity index. And then there's the boundary weight. That's the one where it looks at how much boundary there is between protected and unprotected area relative to this area, the size of the area, so basically the number of closed cells. So that's what goes in here. Then there's the map. Now on this map here, we should be able to set the current cell size, go in and click and say which ones we want as seed cells. Only in my version here, that doesn't work. That's why I put in 3 closed cells. So they work as if they were seed cells. That's something that's on our to-do list. But we can just go in and click them here. But right now they're locked. So that's a small hiccup. It will be fixed. We can run the model now. And you see here first it's put all the neighboring cells to the MPA as seed cells. And now it's the green dot that's moving looks at it goes in and evaluates for each of the seed cells what happens to the objective function when it closes that cell. And this down here just shows what happens over time there. It's losing money. So the net economic value is negative here. Not the best start. I don't know if you can get out of that. That's an artifact from using this play model. But you can see that this is going to take a while But a big
Billy,
advantage.
before you
Yeah.
that actually it's quite possible, and we've commonly found the net economic value to go negative as soon as you put in any protected areas. And what it's trying to say is that if you don't have severe overfishing, if you don't have overfishing in the first place on anything in the Ecopath base case, all that MPAs can do is to cost you economic value. But they can't have any positive. They can only have a positive economic benefit if you cannot prevent overfishing on at least some species by other means. And so when we were working on a California Marine Life Protected Act thing, what we found is that there actually was only one overfished major species in the whole system, and it was already being protected through large rockfish conservation areas. So every strategy we looked at came out negative on the economic side from the fishermen.
It's basically getting worse and worse, and that's also indicates this is not a good indicator or a good sole component of the objective function. We might well have put more in here, but you can see how it works here, and that's all I want to do with this demo. I don't think it has ever been used for anything serious. I'm pretty sure it hasn't. I think the main value of it is that you can go out and you can map what happens as you go from no closures to full closures. Good. Let's stop it and go to the next exercise, which is the one for which there is a tutorial. It's number 17, and it's on the course website. And we're going to go straight down to Ecospace and look again at the maps. I skipped running Ecosim and Ecospace as I normally would do. So here we have a patchwork. I've been running on this. Now what I want to show you is that I have, in addition to what we've seen many times before in the spatial model, I have made something called importance layers, added something there. When you open a model, they won't be there unless it's the saved model here. So in that case, you click the little pen here, and you go in and you add a number of these areas. In this model here, we have 4 importance layers being added. And so they are a rocky bottom, which is interesting for something, dugong feeding area, birds nesting area, and estuary, which is important as a fish rearing area, and because there's high biodiversity in that area. So that's the argument for having these 4 areas. Now the birds are not in the model, the dugong are not in the model, but we still have these importance layers because there's interest in turning those areas, conserving, whatever is the word for it, to protect is the word I'm looking for, these areas. We can see here where they are. There's this rock bottom area which has a protected species. This is where the dugong likes to feed, where the birds nest, and the estuary. So that's the 4 areas. And in the setup right here, it's just, right now it just has 2 of those layers included. It doesn't matter at all. It matters, but not for what we're doing here in the demo. So these layers, by the way, they are raster maps like spreadsheets, and if you, for instance, I think the ideal way of doing a project with that would be to do it in parallel to a Marxan analysis, and then we can read in the Marxan files and use those here as our importance layers. So let's go to spatial optimizations. And Let's hide this. Now we're going to do importance layers. So I click that up here. This is almost the same interface as before. We can make it a little bit different here. And put more into this just for fun. Again, we have the various parts of what's needed to parameterize those. And we have to say here how many times. So in this case here, it's closing from 20 to max 20%. So it's closing 20%. You could do this. You can set this to run and try different values here, like 20, 30, 40, 50, 50, or 0, 10, 20. 0 doesn't make much sense. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and so on, until, yeah, anything's possible. 20 here is how many runs should it do. In a real application, that would be a very large number. But to illustrate it, we can just do 20, otherwise it's going to take forever. And that's about it, what we need to set it up. Now, when we run it, Ecospace, or the routine here in Ecospace, see if we can see a map. It's going to go out once it's done this initialization. It's going to go out and it's going to select 20 cells. Now, in this instance here, it selects 20 cells based on where there's rock bottom and where there's dugong, so they get higher priority. Any cell on the map can be selected, but it's more likely to be the cells where you find the rock bottom and the dugong feeding areas. So it will move along now and it will just try various. And you have to imagine that we're doing this 10,000 times and not just 20. And where are we? We are at 5. We're getting there. Any questions while we're waiting for the 20? Comments from Coll? Marta?
I had a question actually, maybe.
Please.
Which Carl already answered, but I was wondering a bit more. So I asked, Professor Walter mentioned that MPAs will be costly as long as there is no overfishing. I guess because so that you don't increase the catch. But I was wondering if the mean length of the catch would increase without increasing the catch itself, without overfishing. Does this make sense?
No.
Okay.
Fishing reduces the mean length and mean size of the creatures. It's planned to do that. The models that we use account for the effect of fish size on fecundity. They also account for the fact that you can generally reduce total egg production a lot without seeing impairment in recruitment, for which we have hundreds of data sets. This argument that's come out of the conservation community about big old BOFs, big old fat females being important, is utter nonsense. In fact, the guy who first promoted it for groupers off Florida. The guy who developed that term BOF, big old fat females, was a Florida biologist. He was working on groupers. Groupers change sex to males when they're about 8 years old. The big old fat groupers are not even females. And he was still making this goofball argument. No, when we do calculations of whether something is overfished, we explicitly account for the fact that increased fishing is going to reduce the abundance of older animals, it's going to reduce the average size of animals, and that there's a trade-off there. You're taking fewer animals, there's fewer animals in the population, but you're fishing them. Having more animals is not an objective. Mm-hmm. Unless you're a conservationist, you just want to go out and look at them.
Okay, thank you.
So now we run 20 runs. The program then counts up, and the red cells here are those that were included most times in the cells that had the highest objective function. We run 20 and we take the best 10%, that's 2. So we have this constellation and we have these constellations as the best two. And we can sum that up and we can find the overall best constellation, and then we can convert that into an MPA and run with that and see what the implications are. That's the principle of it.
Billy, I was going to ask again if you could clarify what the colors mean in the cell. So the red means the objective, like the highest, the objective functions were best achieved, and the green means the opposite, or can you explain that?
It's just how many. It's really trivial here because we only ran 20. It would be. It's a color gradient for how many times they were included in the best in those best runs. So let's assume we were running it 10,000 times, and we're looking at the best 100 runs, for instance. That would be 1% of the runs. The best 100 being the ones that has the highest objective function. So among those 100, so whatever we're optimizing for here, out of those 100, it would then show on this map how many times each of the cells were included in the best 100. And that's what the color scale in that case would indicate. Here it's really trivial because there are only two. So I think this here means included once, or red are included twice.
So if your objective function had heavily weighted some species or habitat that was used by some highly mobile creatures, then you would expect, if you did a large enough sample, to see the selected cells clumped. The optimization would favor a smaller number of large closed areas. That's where the sloss trade-off would come in. I don't know.
And that is what we found when we did this for the simple Ocean Bay model. That it was areas that were closed down that were included most times.
Let's see, if you have a widely scattered, like the way those red things are, with very few contiguous ones. If you have a creature that lives in one of those red cells, but moves around a fair amount each day during foraging activity and so on, and is quite likely to cross a boundary of the area, that creature is exposed to almost as high a fishing mortality rate as if it lived in an unclosed area, in an open area, right? So the only way to protect creatures like that is to protect the ones that are sort of living near the center of much larger closed areas. Yeah. What do you got dugongs doing in there? Are dugongs carrying much? I didn't understand your weighting on the criteria here, the habitat layers.
Let's go and have a look at that then. On parameterization, we have somewhere importance layers. Where is it? Oh, come on! I found that yesterday.
That's a real manly interface, Billy, when even you can't find anything on there.
Yeah. It's because it's here I was supposed to look. So here we have the dugong feeding area. So that's this area here. What was your question about it? Why they're there? Or in the model? Well, dugong are not in the model. You can see here the model is the usual anchovy bay. It's actually a bit of a surprise that there was these dugong there, but that's of course true.
But if we're, let's say, doing spatial planning, sorry to cut you off, Billy, but if we're doing spatial planning, even if there's, let's say, a species that's not important or not included in our model, if we can overlap their key habitat with maybe what our model shows to be key habitat, then we can maybe get a 2-for-1, conservation area thing going. Is that kind of?
It can be with habitat, it can be with species distribution maps, and it really doesn't need to be in the model. The model here is evaluating. It's worth noting that the objective function is very different from the objective function that you would get out of just trying to preserve. If these are the four things here, the importance layers. If we want to preserve rocky bottom, dugong feeding area, bird nesting area, and the estuary, and we want to sample that and get that efficient, we will be able to do that in the approach that Marxan does. But what can we say about what the consequences are for fishery? I think the way Marxan is doing some of that by putting a value on these cells for how much fishing there is. But it's more complicated than that when we deal with protected areas, because will there be a spillover? What's going to be happening outside? How's the fishery going to be impacted? That's one of the main advantages of this approach, is that you can look at it from a different perspective. We talk a lot about the need to use alternative models, and I think this here is a really good case for using an alternative model for evaluating the marine spatial planning objectives, basically, going beyond just looking at these four importance layers here and trying to preserve those, to actually look at it from a socio-economic and ecological point of view about what are the implications of preserving these for people, for the ecosystem, and to get that, and with a handle on the food web. And for that matter, it's also with the hand web on dispersal between cells. So to me, it's actually surprising why on earth it isn't being used for this. We may not have talked enough about it. An interesting thing here is that when we developed this, we developed it with a colleague from NatureServe, who was working on the US West Coast, doing spatial planning using Marxan, and actually using Marxan and comparing it with Ecospace. So he was doing some of those, some comparisons on this, and NatureServe is the major the key organization for running with Marxan. Marxan is being developed, or has been developed for 20 years or more by, notably by Professor Hugh Possingham at the University of Queensland, and they have promoted a lot and supported and developed it a lot. NatureServe are the ones who have really run with it and used it for multiple projects around the world. And they were actually our partners when we developed this. But for some strange reason, we've never had a project where we are comparing the methods and using, not just comparing is one thing, but actually using them to get two different perspectives for what would be the optimal placement.
One thing here, can we add something here, Billy, to watch out for, is that if you put in a layer representing a unique ecosystem or habitat type, or even a unique species that people want to protect, like Billy and I are working on glass sponge, working on shrimp fisheries here in BC. And there's a really strong onus on any trawling industry off our coast to stay away from the glass sponge reefs. They're highly sensitive, very slow recovery ecosystem or communities. Well, when we start thinking about it, we realize that shrimp fishermen don't trawl on glass sponge bottom areas anyway. But they don't have shrimp in them. They're hugely damaging to the trawl nets. They fill a trawl net full of chunks of sponge and stuff, make it almost impossible to sort things. And another example, there are areas off the west coast of Vancouver Island that trawlers and other commercial fishermen stay away from entirely. And the reason is that those areas are basically infested with dogfish. There's a lot of protection for dogfish sharks because they're unproductive creatures. So if you put in a map layer on an analysis saying that this is dogfish habitat needs to be protected, you're going to get goofy answers unless you recognize that fishing is already avoiding those areas because of the huge cost to fishermen of having to deal with this with dogfish when they fill the net. And it is a big cost. They're dangerous. Guys get stabbed by them and stuff. So you got to watch out about covariation between fishing ability and fishing opportunity and these non-fishing values. Yeah. They're very often linked through the way fishing works.
Yeah, and Coll, those things can be set up in Ecospace. So you can basically have that shrimp trawlers avoid the glass sponge areas, assuming you have put glass sponge areas in here as one of your layers. No, you have to go in as a habitat layer in that case. But
the fishermen won't object to having those areas protected because they're already protected.
No, but the outcome of it, when you run the model here, if you let's say that let's pretend for a second that these hatch ones here, which are MPAs, really is the glass sponge area. Oh no, we can do it another way. Let's say that it's the rocky bottom. That's our. Let's see if I have that down in the habitat. Here, yes, we do. In habitats, this here, the rocky bottom here is not even shown. What? Let me go back and get another map here.
I think it's shown, but just really light.
What we can do is we can just
really pastel colors.
Let's find another symbol for it. Okay, so this is where the now you can see it. That's just because there's overlap in habitats. So the rocky area here is where the rocky bottom is where the rocky bottom habitat is. Bang, that was smart. When you set this up in Ecospace, you go Ecospace Fishery, input, Ecospace Fishery, Habitat Fishery. So here, trawlers fish in coastal and sand. They do not fish in the rocky. They do not fish in the deep in our model. So they will be avoided. They will avoid that area. So when you run this, closing down the rocky bottom or glass sponge area, or whatever it might be, will not impact those fisheries. So they'll be absolutely happy with regards to the social value, the net economic value. They will score high on that.
There's something to think about is that nowadays when we go out and look at these marine, actually coastal ecosystems, these things have been getting pounded by all sorts of pretty nasty fishing gear pretty much everywhere in the world for about a century. So when you see things still persisting out there like glass spongeries, you can make a pretty good bet that it's because they are being avoided by fisheries. If they weren't, they'd have been gone decades ago.
Can I tell you one of my favorite stories about that? Which actually is to counter what Coll says. It depends on the gear too. I heard from my father about a fascinating area south of Norway, which was a deep sea cold area. That the fishermen knew about it, and they knew about it because when they were fishing with gill nets, they would avoid that area because the gill nets would hang on the bottom gill nets. So it was a well-known big area south of Norway, and there was no fishing in there basically. Then in the villains here are the Dutch beam trawlers. They sometime around probably in the 90s, late 90s, they got boats that were big enough that they could go into that area and they smashed it. And I don't know that this area, which was a really big area, I don't know that it was ever probably recorded what was in there or anything else, but they leveled it, and since then trawling has been possible in that area, not just with those big beam trawlers. So yeah, it maybe illustrates.
There's shrimp trawlers around the world claim that what they're doing is cultivating soft bottoms. They're deliberately trawling on. In fact, there was one fishery that developed in the Gulf of Venezuela where they deliberately went in and trawled hard to get rid of larger fish and also structure-forming creatures like sponges and so on in order to promote higher shrimp production.
Shrimp and squid, yeah. I think for the same is described for northern Australia. For some of those shrimp area up in the northwest part by Sainsbury. He talked about that.
Oh no, well that's a different creature. That
what was that?
Well, no, yeah, that's right. The licensed Chinese fishing large vessels to come in and fish, and they were doing that deliberately. Yeah. Because what they were doing is converting basically a sponge coral bottom into a mud bottom, where they got high biomasses, developed high biomasses of low value species that they could sell in bulk, basically. But fortunately they were stopped from doing that.
Okay. I think this is about it for these optimizations. It's about it because we don't have any good applications. And when you combine this with the temporal spatial layer in Ecospace, which, as far as I know, is, has the capability to directly read the Marxan files. We worked on that some years ago. I think, Marta, do you remember that? So you just joined. Didn't you and Jerome develop a way of reading the Marxan layers directly a few years ago for some application in the Mediterranean? Calling Marta.
Hello, Billy.
Yeah.
Hi. No, it was something that we planned, but it's not developed yet. Unfortunately,
that we can read them, or the actual application.
The application is not developed yet, but yes, we can read them.
I thought so. Yeah. So given this, it really is ripe for some spatial planning use, and I hope we'll be able to, or someone will be able to find the project on it. It will be really interesting to see that going. Okay, I'll stop this sharing. And after 23 classes, we are in that strange situation that the program is not overloaded. It's about the first time that happened. So I will open it up for questions. Anything that we've been dealing with. Well, first of course, is anything related to what we're talking about today? But secondly, anything we've been dealing with up to now is a valid topic for discussion.
Billy, I have a question.
Good.
Do you know if anybody has done a study really checking about the impact of dispersal rates in marine protected areas? That's probably something interesting to do if it has not been done yet.
I don't know any systematic evaluation of dispersal rates, and even less any empirically driven evaluation of dispersal rates. And for the kind of studies we're looking at here is absolutely critical. Anything that deals with protected area, it's the key parameter.
We did have a fair amount of dispersal data from tagging and from life history knowledge and so on of different creatures we were putting in the California Marine Life Protected Area Ecospace modeling. Yeah, and that's what led to this loss problem in the this conflict and the need to have protected areas be selected by fishery types.
I have a question, Billy.
Please.
I'm sure it's been brought up in one of the many lectures or tutorials, but if you wanted to account for bycatch and its impact on ecosystem production, is that an option? And at which point would you suggest including that?
It's an area that is of major concern in Europe, where they have this no discard policy. And there has been a number of studies on bycatch impacts. I'm going to ask Marta to answer it, but just mention first that one of the things that that came on very early with regards to this were studies in Mexico on shrimp fisheries and the impact on shrimp fisheries. Francisco Arrigan Sanchez group down there was working quite a bit on that. An interesting thing about the shrimp is that because of the high bycatch in the shrimp trawl fisheries, like 10 times the amount of shrimp, what's happening there is that they are killing predators, competitors, and especially predators on shrimp, and turn them into food for shrimp. So they looked at what is the importance of this additional, turning predators into prey, basically. That's what you look at it from a shrimp's perspective. And the conclusion on that was that it mattered that the predators were removed, but probably not that they were turned into food. Marta, can you summarize what's happening in Europe with bycatch, and also mention some of the many new facilities that's been added because of these projects to the EWE?
Yeah, well, here there's quite a lot of interest. Now it's renewed because this new legislation of zero discards, but it has been here for a while because we had the last 20 years there has been a lot of interest in selectivity, really reducing the discard that the low selectivity fleets have, especially bottom trawlers in multi-species. Here, especially in the south of Europe, the community is quite diverse, so some of the trawling activities may be catching between 100 and 200 species of fish and invertebrates of any type. So there has been a lot of at least trials to make the bottom trawlers more selective, and now recently to really reduce discard. So everything that gets in the net has to be landed. So, but from that, then there has been the legislation has changed, so only to the species that have a value in the market have to be landed, while the rest can still be discarded. So things have been changing while the law is implemented. One of the problems that we had with dealing with discards in Ecosim was the no data in terms of survivalship of the species. So we could account for the fact that when you discard some species, they go back to the system, they may or may not survive. So if you by default assume that everything that is discarded is dead and goes into the detritus and the organic matter, you may be underestimating some of the contributions of discards. So there's one of the things that we did is to, maybe Billy can show it, to put this discard mortality. So now you can, some of these species, for example, Carl was mentioning before, these small sharks that are very resistant and actually do quite well in trawling areas. We have these Stylurinus canicula, the small cat sharks. These things, even if they are caught in trawlers, they are discarded alive.
Oh wow!
So you basically, if you throw them out in the water, they survive in large quantities. So if you model them as you are killing them, you probably are not capturing well what is happening with them, and probably you are actually in highly troll areas. You are kind of cultivating them almost, right? You are killing their like removing the the soil. They are not scavengers, but they feed on small invertebrates, and they're like this kind of very disturbed environments. So one of the things was that trying to add this capacity to discard while not bringing alive some of the things. And
well, let me add a little bit of what Marta is saying. The zero discard thing can backfire really badly. In BC, with our trawl industry, until the 90s, when they started to put observers on every trawl and to require bycatch retention, the trawlers were discarding a really high proportion of the rockfishes that they caught because they were only getting about 20 cents a pound or less. It was filling their holds with low value species. When they were forced to retain those species, they responded to that economically by developing markets for them. They said, if we got to land these things, let's see if we can find a better way to sell them. And the rockfish prices went from 10 or 20 cents a pound up over $1 a pound. And all of a sudden, rockfish became a targeted species. The very creatures that we would want to protect out there from high exploitation rates through non-selective fishing. You had the fishery actually selecting them, deliberately going into areas with high biomasses of creatures that they previously hadn't been able to sell. So you really have to watch out about this business of forbidding bycatch discarding, because sometimes you get more than you wish for.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because that's actually the report that I am going to be presenting on probably in a few minutes or so. They do actually discuss that, how the economic value of the species increased, and thus it was more preyed upon.
Yeah, I could add also, sorry, Billy, there's also, for example, here we have seen a lot of the seabird communities in the Southern Europe. They have been recovering, adapting to taking things from purse seiners and also from trawlers of small fish that are being discarded. Advantage of that. And there has been some debate on if you totally ban the discarding, it also has an impact on these species, and in some cases are a species at risk or a species of conservation concern. So yeah, there's nothing is so sometimes so simple as it looks.
Well, Marta, let's just check how you get discards into EWE. So in the fishery, we can enter discards. For fun, I put in the shrimp trawlers, I put in a little bit of cod and whiting as discards. Then we can put the mortality in on those. Here it shows for everything that's landed, even though it's not discarded, but let's not worry about that. That's fine. So we could put in here survival. When we have discards, we also need to specify where it's going. It's pretty trivial here because there's only one detritus group, and if the dead ones, the fate of the dead ones, I should say, this is where you would go in and put in a dead fish detritus group and channel everything into this dead fish group, and that would be what the birds that Marta was talking about were feeding on, or the sharks, or some bottom feeders, or the shrimp for that matter. And it's just when it was the shrimps, you could see it was not at all enough to make a difference for those. Marta, what else is there? I think there is something more about.
Yeah, you basically in Ecosim you can also bring in now data, time series of landings and time series of discards. Before what you would bring is time series of catch, but now you can actually track both separately. So you could really track both proportions of the total catch. Before you just had catch, and And you can, I think, also force, because so basically when you set the landings and the discards in Ecopath, that proportion of discards over total catch or landings, basically it would be constant in Ecosim. But now you can modify, so you could force those proportions. So you could be increasing that discard proportion in the total catch now. If you have empirical data, imagine that one fleet has been decreasing its selectivity or increasing discards rates, you can now add that in Ecosim.
So here we have discard mortality, discard survival. Yeah. No, total discards is one round.
And when you look into the type of data that you can bring in an Ecosim, then you can see this additional types of data to look into the discards more specifically.
It's very cool. Thank you.
Okay, I haven't checked the chat, so maybe we should go to our two presentations now.
Okay, so I read this concept study, which is titled Fish as a Service in the North Sea, a multidisciplinary project. And this project team consisted of many specialists, but was ultimately led by two MSc students, Kai Gistra and Sebastian van Ham, who executed this study in February of 2020. So the study was motivated by the Dutch government choosing to use the offshore region of the North Sea for the development of wind farms or offshore wind farms, in line with their transition from fossil fuels to renewable as per their commitment to the Paris Agreement. And the North Sea, I learned from this study, contains a lot of different stakeholders, which the authors identified every one of them. It's very impressive. This report presents the design for an artificially enhanced fishery system within an offshore wind farm, with the goal to provide a nature-inclusive solution to increasing pressure on the fishing industry by the growing offshore wind sector. And as a means of resolving these issues with fisheries and offshore wind farm development, they came up with this fish as a service concept. And from that, 2 suitable wind farm sites were selected for development of an artificial reef system that would promote diversity and yield biomass for 5 selected species, and thus allow for a bio-enhanced fishery. And so in this scenario, a company would fulfill the role of managing the bio-enhanced fisheries in the offshore wind farms without the need for the wind farm clients to actively partake in the fishing industry. They used quite a lot of different methods, but as far as the EWE, they used it to predict the amount of biomass produced in the offshore wind farm with and without an artificial reef, or they term it hard substrate. So they created 2 different models, one without hard substrate or the before scenario, and then one after, which is with the reef effect. And they based these models off of a previous study done in 2017, which is with the majority of the biomass and diet data came from. They ended up using 25 functional groups, but they targeted 5 different species: the European lobster, brown crab, Atlantic cod, European sea bass, and the cuttlefish. Oh, darn it, my highlight didn't make it into the slide. This is what their numbers showed as far as their before and after with the sea substrate. And the biggest increase was seen for the European lobster and the brown crab, about 3/4 of the way down. And the authors do talk about how it might be an unrealistic increase that is driven by biomass accumulation. and decreased competition and lack of migration. But it does end up proving to be a beneficial ecosystem. The reef ends up being a beneficial ecosystem for these two species. And when they used Ecosim, the cuttlefish decreased in both scenarios. After 30 years, sea bass remained the same. And yeah, the brown crab and the European lobster skyrocketed. This study was very cool. I learned a lot from it, just everything that goes into it. I know Billy a few weeks ago had mentioned just the amount of work and material that is required for a management study is like enormous. And yeah, that certainly proved true with this concept study. And aside from what I learned from it, I thought something that was really neat that they included was they specifically talked about how the fisheries in this region can be more sustainable and what nets they should use instead and how they can actually limit the bycatch, which is why I asked that earlier. But yeah, so that's a summary of that.
Okay, so the paper I read was by Coll et al. And Marta actually is a co-author on this paper. It's called Multi-Zone Protected Areas, Assessment of Ecosystem and Fisheries Benefits using Multiple Ecosystem Models. Considering IPAs are often advocated to reconcile conservation and fisheries benefits, the main aim of the paper was to assess the effectiveness of the three MPAs over time on the recovery and marine resources of the ecosystem in the area, as suggested by the title of the paper. So the three MPAs were situated off the coast of Spain and France. One of the areas pretty much at the border of France and Spain. And considering my French and Spanish are a little bit rusty and not very good at all, actually. And for brevity, I would just simply number the three areas north to south. So the first one, MPA 1, was established in 1974. The second one established in 1998. And the third one was established in 83. So there are two different levels of protection. As you can see the different colors on each of the plots there. So in full, we have it's shown in red, we have the fully protected areas. And all three sites had those, obviously. Then we have in orange partially protected areas, and in green is shown unprotected areas that were adjacent to the fully or partially protected areas, but were also included into the model for spillover. While in the fully protected areas, all extractive activities are forbidden. In the partially protected areas, there are both small scale and recreational fisheries allowed. So MPA 1 is considered to have more protection and enforcement than MPAs 2 and 3. So for this, they used two different UE models. First was Ecopath, and to establish a baseline, and the years are shown here on the slide for each of the MPA areas. And the second was the Ecosim model. Again, they used time series data to fit the models, and those were the years that they used the time series data for. So the study had quite a bit of results shown, and I'm not going to go over all of them. I'll summarize them more or less. So one of the important results was that biodiversity impact of total catches was lowest in MPA 1 and higher in MPA 3. MPA 2 was actually not included in this analysis, and that seemed to be, expected, considering the MPA 1 had the most protection compared to the other 2 or 3 in this case, because 2 wasn't included. Next one, this is a figure from the paper, and I know it's a little bit busy, so I'll try and sum it up as best as possible. It shows the impacts of fisheries on different species, and you can see the impacts are shown with blue and red, and blue is the positive impacts, red are the negative impacts. And you can see that there's color bars under A, B, and C panels. And the top color bar horizontally is the small-scale artisanal fisheries. The bottom color bar, in this case, is the recreational fisheries. So both recreational and small-scale fisheries had impact on all trophic levels, with the smaller fisheries having the largest negative impact overall on the ecosystem. It is good to note here that despite the overall lower impact of recreational fisheries, both the small artisanal fisheries and the recreational fisheries had strong negative impacts on vulnerable species, something that needs to be considered when setting up management plans for these kinds of species. Also, there was an increase and decrease in total biomasses of the different species. So this is actually evidence that there are food web effects, such as trophic cascades and increased competition, for example, and those are important with winners and losers in the new ecological state. Ecosystem-based indicators showed contrasting results between the three MPAs. So it suggests that there's a limited species and ecosystem recovery. So the overall take-home message is that the study showed positive effects overall, but that the effects are not nearly as much as was expected for temporal protection effects of these areas on the species or the ecosystem. And that's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Sylvia.
Mm-hmm.
So, any comments about this? Marta, you've been doing a number of MPA studies. What have you learned from those?
Well, in this case, the one that Sylvia presented, that she did a good job. Basically, this was a study that was commissioned by the European Commission. They wanted to know what was the state of the MPAs in the Mediterranean and if they were working or not. And the main challenge that we had there is with as you have seen in this study, that the MPAs are tiny, little small. So really, to evaluate these tiny MPAs is quite a job. And we also realized that the data that we had, there was a mismatch between the data that we had, that basically comes from the commercial part of things, that the fisheries, but there's quite a lot of extra activities in those areas, like recreational fisheries, artisanal fisheries, that we didn't have a lot of data for. So that was also another challenge, really, to put all this data together and try to evaluate these very coastal MPAs. We have been trying to do that in several places in the Mediterranean, and bringing in or reconciling these very local studies or local models with more of the regional. The European Commission and the national governments, what they want to know if these MPAs work at the national level, but it's obvious that if they are so small, their impact is really, really local. And that was the struggle that we had there, and we have been having in several places. So bridging skills between what they are asking us to do and what we can really model with the data that we have is a challenge nowadays. That was one of the big learnings.
What about the issue, you're talking about small MPAs, when they might be in a bigger model and be absolutely tiny. How do you handle that?
Yeah, well, that's a big challenge, because sometimes, like one of these small MPAs that you saw there, the fully protected area, if you build a regional model of the area, they may represent one pixel or 2 pixels in your regional model. So there's really no way you can represent what's happening in that area in terms of full protection. Because there is recovery when you go to the communities. Underwater communities are recovering, but the scale is so small that bringing that or assessing that, what is the impact at the regional level, is very difficult. One of the things that we have been working on is what we call the Biomass Emitter, where we basically allow in regional models to bring in the local effects or the local effects that we observe maybe with field work or with local models. Imagine that you have a very detailed model of a local MPA and you want to assess what is the impact at the regional level. You can summarize those impacts, bringing in the biomass that pixel emits in the regional context. So we have been trying to build that. It's like emissions of biomass that later you see if at the regional level that has any impact at all. As in one initiative. The other one is downscale. It's really trying to make your models much more resolved in terms of the spatial resolution, but that has big implications, are very important challenges, because most of the times we don't have the data in such a large resolution. So it's we don't have the recipe yet. It depends on where you are, the data that you have, and the question that you want to answer with those models.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions or comments? Fantastic. Maybe today is the day we end earlier.
The question that about a few lectures ago on the Monte Carlo issue, if I understand, it's more a comment than a question, because I understand you didn't do it, but I see when you run the Monte Carlo for the model parameters, uncertainty parameters, it doesn't include the vulnerability parameter, but I see the vulnerability is also as a parameter that you have uncertainty to. I would think that it is best to set some uncertainty borders to the vulnerability and run it as well with the other parameters. Is that the right thinking?
That is the right thinking, yes. And there are other parameters that may be of interest. It mainly reflects the limits of what we can do with the interface. So, and whether it's general enough. So this is the kind of question you could address from a plugin. To add from a plugin, you would need to develop a plugin to add more parameters. It is feasible, and yeah, you could certainly do it for vulnerabilities, and for many other parameters too, for that matter. But that would be an interesting choice.
I think that we can call it a day.
Let's do that. So the plan is that on Thursday, Marta is going to present the global ecosystem model, EcoOcean, and its use. What we plan to do on Tuesday is, in addition to saying thank you and all of that, to have a session, kind of a bring your own model question session. How do I model? So if you have anything you would be interested in modeling, which I hope there is since you are in this class, that's a good opportunity to ask those questions. And again, I would like to emphasize that in order for us to understand it, it has to be simple questions, because we don't know how to answer the complicated question. So don't be shy because you're afraid that your question is too simple. That's fantastic. That means that we can actually have a chance of answering it, which we really love to do. But we've had those sessions in connection with some of the, like in Ecopath 35, we had 2-3 hour sessions of this kind where we were just talking about such questions and maybe demonstrating how would you go about implementing those questions in Ecopath, Ecosim, Ecospace, or wherever it may be. So do think about that for Tuesday, if there are any questions or whatever questions you may have, and we'll spend some time on going through those questions. And that's about it for today. So thank you very much. and we'll finish the session here.